Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Survivor 48 following episode 7, which was the split tribal episode. And this was a fine episode, all things considered. I feel like there's some interesting stuff here and some interesting outcomes, but that's it enough. But we have 12 people to talk about as we spend more time. Let's get into the video. So starting off at number 12, we have the first boot from this week, and here we have Say. And again, I feel like the Say boot here is pretty predictable. I feel like she got plenty of setup to going out here with her talking early on about how her vote for Cedric was for revenge. You have her scene with Shaheen where she's talking about how like she struggles with surface level talk, and then Shaheen just kind of dunking on her for that. And again, I feel like there's just a lot of setup for it. Not to mention that the actual try breakdown for that round made it so that she was a pretty easy target regardless. And I feel like with Mitch getting better content compared to her, I feel like it was pretty obvious she was going out by the end of it. And I think Say going out in the spot is pretty interesting, as she is the final pre-juror. She is the first to go out in the split tribal. And something we had seen in the last couple seasons was that the person that goes out in the spot as the final pre-juror typically gets a smaller edit to where it makes us not feel as bad for them going out pre-jury, where we saw Sifu in 45 getting a pretty minimal edit, Tim Spicer from 46 also getting a pretty quiet edit. Even Tiana from 47, while she got a bit more to do, still got pretty inconsistent content on the show. So for Say to be the one to go out in the spot, despite her getting a massive edit, is pretty interesting and definitely a departure from the last few seasons. And again, Say was a pretty massive character in the season, where I believe she broke the record for confessionals by a pre-juror with 53. And yes, while she was helped by factors like 90-minute episodes, her tribe going to tribal a lot, and the fact that she was just in more episodes than other pre-jurors, I still think it's interesting seeing Say being this pretty massive character and someone that Jeff clearly liked. Though at the same time, she was never a contender to win in my eyes, where I feel like her massive edit just made her way too overexposed. Not to mention she got tons of negativity with people constantly talking about how she was overbearing and too much. And again, despite her being a big character, I never really saw her as that big of a threat to win the season. And obviously she's now out of the game to where she's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have the other boot from this week, and here we have Cedric, Say's fellow partner. And it is kind of funny how Say and Cedric end up going out back to back here as these old Vulas, and for Cedric to be the one to be on the jury is pretty funny as well. And similar to Say, I did expect Cedric to be the boot from his side of things, considering the breakdown of his team, making him a pretty easy target. And while there wasn't as much setup in this episode to him being the boot, I feel like his edit in general is just very perplexing, where despite him being this pretty big player early on and being this pivotal vote at so many tribals he attends, he gets very service level content, and I feel like we never really get to see his perspective, and we are not really being shown up as him being that good of a player. We're even at the points where he talks about the Bianca vote. I feel like it didn't really come off as him like making that smart of a decision. And in general, I feel like with just how strange his edit was, I feel like him being a first juror made a lot of sense inherently. And just seeing the breakdown of his tribe, I feel like it just made even more sense. And yes, while there was some setup to them possibly flipping the vote on Shaheen, I just never thought that was going to go through by the end of it. So again, Cedric going on the spot isn't too shocking. And similar to Say, never really saw Cedric as a contender. I feel like his edit was just all over the place to where it was just kind of hard to really pin down where he was truly going. Where the one thing I was pretty certain about was that he was not winning, though at the same time, he definitely had some setup for a bit of longevity on the season. But at the end of the day, him being a first juror isn't surprising either. So again, not really someone who stood out that much to me, and he's not out of the game to where he's here at number 11. And with that, we have 10 people left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. But number 10, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on is still Chrissy. And this was just kind of a bland episode for Chrissy, if I'm being honest. And also kind of bad in the sense that we see her talking about wanting to target Mitch, which kind of goes against her content from earlier, where she had previously talked about wanting to stick Diva strong, only for her to suddenly want to target Mitch. And despite that, she doesn't even go through with it. She doesn't even vote out Mitch in this spot. So it's kind of a case where she's just contradicting herself for no real reason other than to give us a little bit of suspense here. And beyond that, I feel like I still have the same issues with Chrissy as before. She doesn't really pop off as that big of a character in the season, and is someone who just doesn't seem to be that big of a priority in the story. So I feel like this episode didn't really change my view on Chrissy, and if anything, it just went down even further, considering she blatantly contradicts herself by talking about wanting about Mitch, only to not do so. So for that reason, I do have her here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have someone who has continued to go downhill, and here we have Mary. And Mary's kind of in a weird spot to where at this point she's actually the last remaining Vula, which is kind of interesting considering her underdog story, but despite that, she doesn't really get anything to do in this episode. She gets zero confessionals there, which is even worse considering she still went to tribal in this episode, and the fact that she doesn't get anything to do here is pretty bad. Where the only thing I really took note of from her in this episode is her talking about how she thinks Say will be pre-jury, which, I mean, yeah, sure, that's a positive since she ends up being correct. But beyond that, I feel like there's just so many missed opportunities. And at this point, I'm just not feeling it for Mary at this point. I feel like if she were the winner, she would be way more prominent at this point in the season. But as is, I do have her here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have someone who I've also gone down on after this episode, and here we have Camila. And this was another pretty bad episode for Camila here, where she's once again being overshadowed by Kyle, where he is now getting more of the focus for the duo, which was pretty interesting considering how things were earlier in the season. But on top of that, she is once again contradicting herself, where she spends a lot of the episode wanting to target Shaheen. She's even part of the scheme to frame Shaheen by telling David that she thinks that he could have an idol. And again, the fact that Camila gets so much focus in this actual scheme, only to not actually vote out Shaheen in this spot, is pretty bad there. And it's made even worse when they cut to the other tribe right before going to tribal, where you have Say and Chrissy talking about what they think is going to happen. And Chrissy literally says that it would be the smart move to target Shaheen in this spot. So the fact that they include that in the edit, only to blatantly show Camila and Kyle not making the smart move and targeting Shaheen over Cedric, is all really bad and just further sinks her chances of actually winning. So at this point, I'm completely out on Camila, and that's the very reason why she's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have someone who I just mentioned, and here we have Kyle. And I feel like Kyle has the same knocks against Camila, where he spends a lot of the episode talking about how he wants to target Shaheen, only to not do so. And we even see the show going out of its way to demonstrate that that's not the smart move, and that Kyle did not do the smart move in targeting Shaheen here. So again, all that's really bad. Now, and you can argue that Kyle should be below Camila, as Kyle got more of the focus here and wanted to target Shaheen. Kyle was the one who more actively talked about targeting Shaheen, only to back out of it. So again, I think there's a lot of debate there, but at the end of the day, I feel like they're both dead. I feel like this episode in general is pretty bad for both of them. And you also have Kyle talking about how he and Camila are the most undercover duo ever, which makes me think even more that they're going to be exposed eventually. So I feel like they're both being set up for a fall at some point, which is why I do have him here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and this person's pretty different from the people we already talked about, as this person's actually been going up a little bit over time. But number 6, we do have Star, and I feel like this was another good episode for Star, where she gets a pretty decent confessional about how people have goals for the jury, but her goal is to get beyond the jury and how she wants to make the final 3. And again, I feel like that's a pretty good piece of content there, though it also raises the possibility of her being a losing finalist. And in general, I still don't think Star is a very likely winner at the end of the day. And there's also a knock in the fact that she talks about wanting to vote out Mitch, who's a strong competitor, how her strategy is to take out the strongest physical threats, only to not vote out Mitch there. So again, it's not perfect for Star, and considering how mediocre her early game was, I still think she's probably not going to win. If anything, this rising content is more so set up for her being a losing finalist, if anything. But it was still a better episode for her compared to other people, and it was enough to elevate her a little bit, so because of that, she's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and this person is remaining around the same spot compared to last week, and here we have David. And this was just kind of a fine episode for David, where actually the biggest pro I can give him is he does technically get his way here, where he talks about wanting to target Cedric to keep the Honor and Integrity Alliance together, and he does that. He gets his way there, which is good there. However, I have also been seeing more talk online about how David is being set up to being a losing finalist, and I am starting to see it a little bit, though it's not enough to really drive him all the way down this ranking just yet. And really his placement here is more so due to me being higher than other people at this current point, though I still think this was not a terrible episode for David at the end of the day. But I think with me being higher than other people at this point, I do have to leave him behind here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and this is another person who didn't have a bad episode per se, but also not a particularly great one. But number 4, we do have Eva, and to me this episode is just kind of fine if I'm being honest. For Eva, where she talks about how she wants to target Say as she creates chaos and how she wants to get her out before, and she does that. She does end up getting her way there. Though at the same breath, she also talks about Mitch being a threat later on in the game and how this is an important vote as it will dictate a lot of the rest of the game. And you could argue that her keeping Mitch in the game could end up biting her later on by keeping her on this big threat who could end up winning. So I think that's definitely something to consider. But really, I think her placement here is more so due to her starting to get overshadowed again by other people. And while there wasn't much for her to do in this episode, I think the fact that she's not starting to build her case more in this post-merge phase of the game could be a worry for her later on and could cause her to slide down in the rankings later on in the season. But I think for now, I still think she's looking good enough, especially compared to the people we already talked about. That makes me still want to have her here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this is where the list gets a bit more complicated as I really debated what to do with this person. I'm actually very mixed on this person if I'm being honest, as I've heard a lot of people online talking about how this person is clearly the front runner at this point, and I can definitely see their argument. However, I think there's also plenty of reason to be concerned as well. But number 3, we do have Shaheen. And I'm kind of conflicted over Shaheen's episode here, where I know a lot of people were very high on Shaheen in this episode, talking about how this is just like the content that Rachel got last season, where he's being propped up as this threat and someone that they probably should be taking out. How it would be the smart move to take out Shaheen, only for him to not be taken out here, which is obviously bad for the likes of Camila and Kyle, who did entertain this move, but also good for Shaheen, the fact that the show is elevating him as a threat, and yet he's still there in the game. So I think a lot of that's pretty good. You also have his scene with Say, where he's talking about how he doesn't like Say's approach to the game and how she tends to see conversations and connecting with people as purely transactional, whereas he likes to be a bit more authentic. So again, I think there's a lot to like about Shaheen's episode here. Though at the same time, I am also conflicted over whether he'll just be like the final boss of the season, where he does also talk in this episode about how he's the one controlling the game, how every move has to go through him. And to me, that kind of comes off as a bit overconfident and could definitely scream out as someone to be taken out at some point along the way, and sort of him being like this big player and this big threat. And on top of that, there's also the concerns that you have from him from earlier in the season, like his episode 4 being pretty bad. You also have him not truly having a one-on-one relationship. And while if you compare him to Rachel and saying that Rachel also had a mediocre pre-merge and how this is the point in the game where she's starting to peak, I still think those things are enough to give me some pause here, and I think we'll definitely need to see another episode to see if Shaheen's able to build upon this, if he's able to turn around and start to have this bigger storyline, how him saying things like how every move in the game has to go through him is not just him being set to be taken out at some point. So while I still think this was a good episode for Shaheen, I think there's definitely a reason to have him as a contender. I think there's enough hesitation there that makes me not want to have him at number 1 just yet. So for now, I do have him here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and we have someone who's kind of in a similar boat to Shaheen, even though a lot of people online don't seem to agree. By number 2, we do have Mitch. And I thought this was also a pretty good episode for Mitch, all things considered. And in a lot of ways, I feel like there's a lot of parallels here between Mitch and Shaheen, where both of them are being talked about as big threats across this episode. You have the likes of Star and Eva talking about how Mitch will be this long-term threat and how they need to get rid of him sooner rather than later, only for Mitch to not go home here, which I think is pretty interesting there. And I think a lot of the Rachel comparisons can also apply to Mitch here. And in many ways, you can say that this is also the start of Mitch's story, where obviously I said last week that Charity going out could be this big turning point in Mitch's story. And I think in a lot of ways, it did play out here, where we did see Mitch reacting to the Charity blind side, talking about how he and Charity were close and how he needs to kind of start over. And we do see him bonding the next day with other people, talking to Joe, talking to Shaheen, and really trying to build connections there. That leads to a lot of people talking positively about him. And yes, while you could say that Mitch could also be like this final boss of the season, someone who will eventually be taken out for being too big of a threat, I think the fact that people are so high on Shaheen but not really feeling the same way about Mitch is a bit unfounded in my view. I feel like they're kind of around the same level and both have similar arguments to being contenders at this current point. And I think the thing that gives Mitch the edge for me is the fact that Mitch doesn't have that overconfidence of him talking about how he's running the game or anything the way that Shaheen does. And I think on top of that, Mitch had a stronger pre-merge edit as well. I think there's definitely some minor things that give Mitch the edge over Shaheen at this current point, even though there's still definitely some concern about them being targeted down the road, how this talk about them being a threat will not go away in the future. So again, not really enough to make him the true contender, like this runaway favorite to win. But I think this was still a pretty solid episode for Mitch. He definitely got to really have this restart to his game, and I feel like it was enough to have him here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Survivor 48 at this current point is still Joe. And admittedly, this wasn't a massive episode for Joe by any means. I feel like he's definitely not the biggest character this season, which may work to his benefit in the sense that despite him coming off as this person that could easily win at the end, he's not really being talked about as a threat, which I think is pretty good there. He also gets his really good moment after the immunity challenge, where as Jeff is handing in the necklace, he gets to talk about his kids, which felt pretty unnecessary there, especially compared to David, who actually beat Joe in the challenge, but didn't get to have a similar personal moment. I think that's also just another way the show going out of its way to prop up Joe at every opportunity here. Now, admittedly, it wasn't a perfect episode either, where he does talk about how Say is a safe vote while Mitch is a long-term vote, but yet despite that, he goes for Say and doesn't really take up Mitch there, despite him also saying that Mitch is someone who could just sneak in and win at the end. So I think you can knock him a bit for that. Though at the end of the day, I still feel like this was a good enough episode for Joe. And considering that he's not really being talked about as a threat either, I think there's definitely a lot of reason to still have Joe here at number 1. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It helps with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the Power Rankings again, so you can look forward to that. And I'm also covering The Amazing Race 37, so be on the lookout for content on that show. I'm on Patreon and have YouTube memberships, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is a video. See ya.